So Caroline and I were chatting about the process of resumes and interviews and all of that kind of thing. So we're sort of sharing a couple of tips. Just a bit of background. My company, one of the things we do is office recruitment and bookkeeper recruitment, things like that. So we're sort of having a chat about how to prep your resume.
It was really interesting. A lot of it's about culling, isn't it?
It is. At that point, you were revising your resume.
That's right.
And so we were chatting about what you'd really done at that point is there's sort of a few rounds in creating a resume. So the first round is what you had done, which was just collect all that information. What have I actually done over the last, however long you've been in the workforce, and just get those dates and names and all of that important stuff and put it in an organized sequence. And people get a bit stuck and think that's all I have to do. They think about a resume as being a bit of a job history. But I think what we were chatting about was when you're ready to submit the resume to a potential employer, at that point, the resume is not about you. It's about them. And it's not about your history. It's about what can you show that you can bring to the next role. So you've really got to cut it down. So we went through that process of cutting down. You get in this place where you're in your head and you're thinking about that whole time that you're at that job, all these things that you did. But if you actually put that aside and take the job application, have a look at it. The main important part to looking at a job application is the section. It's usually in the bottom or in the middle. It'll either say selection criteria or successful applicant will have. It almost always has one of those two headings. Tailor your resume to fit that list as much as possible. So how much of your experience fits that list? And how can you put it together? It sort of gets back at that communication. How do I say this as clearly as possible so that you as the reader, you as the potential employer don't have to do any work? How can I just show you? I want to set it out so that that's consistent. So you always put the same formatting. So always put, say, the job title and then the employer and then the dates or whatever sequence you pick. Don't just say I was the sales manager and here's what I did. It was as the sales manager, I was responsible for, and then a bullet point list of maybe 3 or 4 things that are relevant to this job. And you really have to retailer the resume. It's not your resume. It is a resume you're writing for this job application. Right. If you're applying for 3 or 4 jobs, they might be in the same industry. They might all be in retail. But each of those, say it's like a shop down the road, each of those shops is going to have a different emphasis and a different focus. So if you're applying to McDonald's, they're looking for a different skill set than if you're applying to one of the cafes that's more of a full service cafe.
Yeah. Would it be worthwhile doing a little bit of research on your potential employer, or is that going to be confusing?
Now, I always look at the employer's
Facebook page or something?
Facebook page, website, and look at the way that they write about themselves.
Their culture.
Their culture. It's very important. Yes. How did you find that process of going through?
I took the focus off myself and back onto the company, onto the role, just like you said. And I thought that was really interesting how you said in the first phase that they could possibly automatically scan for keywords that are in their job description that may be in your resume. And it is quite breathtaking to think that that's where we're at. The job that I was looking at on the site of the job agency had over 17,000 hits. Now, that could have been the same person several times. That was probably me 5,000 times. But that's quite frightening. I linked that idea with what you'd told me and thinking, my goodness, you've got to be competitive. And you have to not just think this or that might be helpful to them. You have to be thinking and writing your resume, your CV, as though they can't do without you. So how does that sound? And how does that look on paper? That's what you're aiming at.
And I said to Caroline, it sort of comes across a bit mean, but it's a matter of practicality. It's not about you, this job application. It's how can you stand up and make yourself a clear benefit.
It sounds to me like they're looking for someone super efficient.
We put up job ads on Seek for like an office administrator or something like that. We might get 400 applications. So you can't go through in fine detail you can't get invested in everyone's life story. It's in that first pass, it's about who gets it.
And who gets through that resume process is then who they're going to interview. So you've got to show your verbal skills and your tenacity in your resume, and then you get the opportunity to follow up with your interview.
If you're applying through one of the big agencies or via some of the websites, some of them are actually computer scanned initially.
I was wondering,
Yeah, so you want to, if you can address some of their keywords, use their words. You don't need to be overly creative in that area. It's about showing them that you get their language and you get what they're looking for.
You'd said to me about some elements in styling. Now, they wanted to know about some capabilities that to me was just a given. If you were doing styling, you know how to do them. But you said to me, no, list them. And I almost felt like, I feel like I'm copying someone else's work. To me, it felt too obvious, but you can't be too obvious.
You can't be too obvious. And also the first person reading your resume may not be a stylist. So it could be a generic sort of level 2 recruitment person, like a recruitment admin person.
Yeah.
They're literally there to tick words off a list.
And what about fonts, Anita? I always got told to use the most plainest fonts, but can you...
Use one font.
Yep.
You pick one font, use it throughout. Be very consistent. So in Word, especially in the new version of Word, they made it really easy to pick the headings. So use
Body
those,
text and things like that.
Yeah, use body text, heading 1, heading 2. If you want, you can change the defaults. You don't have to stick to the defaults, but use a high visibility font, which means soft, round lines. So Times New Roman is okay. Arial is probably the most readable font. It's quite soft, it's quite round. Basically, you don't want to create any barriers. Don't add a lot of colour. I've got 2 colours on mine. I've got like a grey and a black, and that's just sort of to make the headings stand out, but that's probably about as far as I'd go. It is going to depend on different industries. So if you're in a very visual industry, think about this as your opportunity to present your skills. So if it's about consistency and cleanliness and you want to make sure that you're pulling that across, in some of the more visual ones you might want to bring in a bit more, but do it in a way that's not going to detract from the message.
Yes.
So it's about just staying on focus.
And we don't use a cover sheet anymore?
You can use a cover letter. So often they will ask for a cover letter. In a cover letter, you're just trying to make one point. Sometimes they don't even read the resume, the first pass. They might even just look at the cover letter. Sometimes they don't look at the cover letter and they just look at the resume. So in your cover letter, it's the opportunity to draw out one really good reason why you're the best fit. And don't go into any more detail than that. I'm a good fit for you. Here's why. Here's a bit of an explanation as to a particular example in which draws straight from that selection criteria, and then make sure whatever point you cover in that cover letter is very strongly themed throughout your resume as well. Whether or not you get paid for a role is kind of irrelevant. To me, it's about, so I took this as a job and this is what I achieved in that role. I put it in the same flow with the other jobs, and I just put in brackets voluntary if you want to highlight that. It's about how does you participating in that experience help this new employer.
Yes.
That's great.
The fact that it's voluntary doesn't really make a difference, I think.
Oh, that's really good to
That is
know.
good.
Yeah. So volunteer can be really, really helpful.
It's a really interesting process that makes you think about yourself, and you gain confidence when you do it. It's a bit sad to let some things go, but then that's when you focus back on what Anita was saying, that it's about the role and the company, not about you. So I had 4 or 5, I think the 5th page was a lot of listings of things when you want to say see attached folio, references available on request. That kind of thing. But with spacing and culling, I got it down to 2 pages. If you're scanning through someone's resume, 10 seconds to look at 2 pages, it's what pops.
Yeah, that's
You have
right.
to make things pop out.
Wow.
And that's where I think consistency in the font and in the sizing, in the number of points, whether it's 10 or 11 or that you've
easy to
put
read.
everything in, that you're not looking at changes in text. Their eye is not going to that. Their eye is going to the content.
That's right.
Rather than the format.
And I like the way you said that you got it down to 2 pages and you had see attached. If they're going to make that effort to go and look at your folios, that means you've got them.
So if people want a takeaway tip, maybe read someone else's resume, because you remember that experience when you were reading my resume. You read it differently, don't you? So if you're quite conscious about the process you go through when you read someone else's resume, like you found yourself sort of flicking and skipping.
Yeah, Anita was looking at me, she said, have a look at mine, and my brain was racing. I'm thinking, I haven't got much time and I really want to read this and take away as much as I can.
Yes.
Anita was watching me look at the resume and she said, now see how little time you're spending. And I thought, oh, guilty.
So you were doing
that
the
was
quick
me.
scan, were you?
And I wasn't even the employer.
And that's someone with a vested interest in the information.
And so that when Anita said, so imagine that's the amount of time or less they are going to spend looking at yours.
Right.
Because you're trying to take away as much as possible with as little time. That's the whole key.
So it's a good exercise to read someone else's resume and get someone else to read yours. And at the point when you start to kind of lose interest, sounds a bit mean again, but really you will. You'll start to read and you go, well, I just actually don't care about you this much. That is the point where you need to stop writing. So highlight it. Yeah, it's important.
Goodness
I love
me.
it.
So you actually want to keep off a couple of things. So you want to keep off high school dates, high school graduation dates. Don't put your birth date on there. Don't put a photo, things like that. And part of that is around the legal obligations that an employer has to not be seen as discriminating. So if there's something that could potentially sway an employer from a perspective of gender, age, or any of the sort of categories they've got as discrimination, you want to sort of keep that off. You don't want them to discriminate against you if you're young or old, but you also want to give them the opportunity to not be in that position.
Don't you love working for yourself? I would summarise up a little bit and say, if you're going for a job at KFC, perhaps you could get Joe Blow to help you, or you could even do some research on the internet. But if you were going for a job that, I suppose, the bigger the payroll, the more assistance you might seek in getting your resume done properly.
Yeah, it's definitely worth it, especially if you haven't really done the job search before. It can be really, really useful getting someone with a professional eye to have a look over it. It's not actually that intuitive, writing a resume. So
sounds like a lot of work.
There's a lot, and it's really time consuming. Don't give yourself an hour, give yourself a week.
Well, I suppose for the bigger the job, the more responsibilities that the job carries, the more you should put into it. Like a job at a local cafe, you could whip that up in an hour.
Depends how competitive it is.
Yeah,
so
true.
if you're going for one of the local jobs and there's a lot of people going for it, it's actually almost just as difficult when you don't have much experience to put on, because how do you make yourself look relevant?
How do you prove your capability?
And another real positive of volunteering is well-being. You're with like-minded people and you feel that you've got a purpose. So there's two good things about
Beneficial all
volunteering.
around.